Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to give people just a few minutes to hop onto the webinar before we get started tonight. Good evening. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for being here. We're going to give everyone probably about 6:03 to hop on before we get started. Okay, because everybody's time is valuable, I'm going to kick us off. Thank you again for being here on this really gorgeous October evening that we're just having fantastic weather today. Welcome to the Chesapeake Legal Alliance's status report for 2023. CLA is a small nonprofit organization. We're based in Annapolis, Maryland, and we provide free legal services to people and partner organizations across the Chesapeake Bay watershed on behalf of healthier local water quality and a cleaner, more restored Chesapeake Bay. There are 7 of us on staff in total. 6 of us are attorneys, and we also have an operations manager who helps us keep things running brilliantly. And while we are a small team, we work with a network of attorneys from across the watershed. And with those, approximately 300 attorneys on our team, we are able to leverage more than $5 million of free legal services to our partners and clients every year. My name is Molly Brown, and I am a senior attorney with CLA. I direct our Community Legal Education Center, which you will hear more about later on in the evening. Tonight, I am joined by our executive director, David Reed. And before I hand it over to David to tell us a little bit about what we're going to be doing this evening, a little bit more about the organization, just a couple of notes. This presentation is being recorded, so it will be posting on our website as soon as we can. So if you'd like to share it with anyone who wasn't able to be here tonight, you can just point them to our website and they'll be able to locate it there. The second thing I just want to note is that our hope is to keep the next hour or so of our time really informal and conversational. If you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and enter them into the question box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer them as we go this evening, but we've also left time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that we didn't have a chance to answer during the time thus far. All right, and with that, I want to hand it over to David.
Thank you, Molly, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Molly said, Chesapeake Legal Alliance is the only legal services organization that provides free environmental legal services to the Bay watershed. And we do this through 3 separate but integrally linked centers. We have the CLA's Environmental Action Center, our Community Legal Education Center, and our Community Outreach Center. Our Outreach Center also works with is the lead on our pro bono network. And we have a pro bono network of over 300 attorneys across the watershed. Through them, we are able to reach the maximum amount of community legal needs and partner needs via one of our network lawyers. And what this means is we can work with environmental organizations like riverkeepers, local community groups, and individuals to help expand our services across the watershed and across types of need. That pro bono outreach center also works with regularly universities and legal clinics, law firms, other partnering organizations, and community groups to maximize our reach into communities. And working in tandem with our outreach center is our Community Legal Education Center, which similarly works with all of these organizations and all of these groups to help provide and coordinate legal education to all of these same organizations. The Environmental Action Center was a product of our merger in 2020. That center provides direct legal services to all these groups and allows our staff attorneys to directly represent clients and to proactively build strategies and initiatives that best address the largest problems in the watershed and the largest problems of our partnering organizations and community groups. Today, this evening, we'll give you an overview of our recent work and some insight into our future plans for 2024. And we'd like to hear from our attendees, and anyone that has a question, please put it in the chat box, and we will both try to integrate it throughout the hour, but also address them at the end. I think first, and I'll hand it over to Molly in a second, but I'd like to just talk about our why. What is the basis for the need for the services of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance? And, our why is complicated, but at base, it is to provide environmental legal services across the watershed to address the many impacts and issues throughout the Bay region. Molly?
So I know that many of you on the webinar tonight are already familiar with the watershed, but we would be remiss to not give you a little bit of information, an overview for those of you who are not familiar with it, and then maybe a little bit of a refresher for those of you who do know about the watershed. You can see the map that's on the screen right now. The watershed is absolutely huge. It covers, 64,000 square miles of territory. It starts up in Cooperstown, New York, drains down through the center third of Pennsylvania. It hits on parts of Delaware, almost all of Maryland, DC, a little bit of West Virginia, and then about the upper 2/3 of Virginia. So it covers, 7 different legal jurisdictions. When we're doing our work, we are doing work in all of those 7 different jurisdictions. There are 18 million people who live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. You can see on the screen a couple of numbers. There are 11,684 miles of shoreline. That is longer than the shoreline of the West Coast of the United States. There are more than 3,600 species of plants and animals that make their home in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the bay holds more than 18 trillion gallons of water. 51 billion gallons of water of that flow into the bay every day from the freshwater tributaries within the watershed. So when we're talking about the environmental issues that the bay is facing, we're talking about things that happen way up in upstate New York, down to right on the coast of the bay proper. So CLA works on these issues throughout the watershed in all of these different aspects of how pollution enters the bay. David, do you want to talk a little bit about what some of those impairments are and what some of the issues the bay is facing today?
Yeah, thank you, Molly. So, as you indicated, it's big watershed, and there is a lot of expanse that flows down the major tributaries, of course, all from the headwaters around the edges of the watershed, through those tributaries and into the bay. And what that means is there are a lot of different types and volumes of pollutants. And one of the things that the Chesapeake Bay program through the Environmental Protection Agency, but also through the Bay Partnership of the Bay jurisdictions, the major Bay states, of course, being Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, but also the District of Columbia, Delaware, and West Virginia, and New York, all the way up to New York. And the best way that they could think of, and I think the best way to do it, is to tackle primary pollutants of concern. And we're on that slide, good. So, you can see them here. What does that mean? Nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and then we have sort of an other, PFAS, microplastics, but that can include all types of toxics. And the way we measure that is to look at loading through these water bodies. What are the types of pollutants that load into the different tributaries and major rivers? How do we measure it? And then how do we limit those? And of course, there are permit schemes for every state, and they're based on the Federal Clean Water Act and other programs, the suite of environmental laws that regulate that. But really, we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, and they're all interconnected. And the major sources, of course, you can see up here are agriculture and the different industrial practices of agriculture, urban and suburban runoff, and of course, wastewater and wastewater treatment facilities. These things have been addressed in different fashions by different statewide permits and different programs. For example, in Maryland in particular, Maryland's done a pretty good job of addressing and requiring and over time funding enhanced nutrient removal. So they are trying to upgrade and maintain those upgrades in all wastewater treatment facilities. And it's working over time. It's dramatically reducing the nitrogen and the phosphorus. However, issues from runoff, particularly agricultural, but also municipal, create a lot of sediment, and phosphorus binds to sediment. So it also dramatically impacts phosphorus loads. And
Dave,
of course, there's...
May I interrupt you for a second?
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about runoff, what do you mean?
So, any land surface, whether it be agricultural or urban or some mix, you're talking about rainwater and stormwater running off the land and carrying with it whatever pollutants are on the surface. One of the reasons that we hear about the benefits of forested wetlands, forested areas, intact natural habitats, is they not only act like a sponge and they maintain and retain sediment, they also maintain and retain the nutrients and toxics, for that matter, by the way. So you'll hear terms like ecosystem services. That's a real thing. And I think it's dramatically undervalued, because an acre of forest or forested wetland not only keeps the sediment and volumes of water from running off into tributaries, but it converts and keeps, basically uptakes a lot of the nutrients in that stormwater, aside from just holding on to the sediment. But it also can bind toxics. So they are a huge benefit. It's one of the reasons that maintaining forested buffers in and around agricultural areas, reforesting, and restoring stormwater areas and riparian areas in and around municipalities are critical to this effort. Can we go to the next slide?
Thanks, sure.
So why do we do what we do? Well, we do our best to look at where the impacts are greatest, but also we're a small, streamlined organization. We have 7 staff. We do our best to rely heavily on the network, but a lot of the staff-led initiatives are done on a budget of about $1 million. So we're small but mighty. So we have to choose carefully where we put our resources. So I just want to talk a little bit about our legislative efforts and some of these wins. We'll talk also, Molly will talk about our education program and some of our outreach initiatives. We'll touch on that, and then we'll talk about some of the litigation and those initiatives. So in brief, and I will try not to spend too much time on it because we're already 15 minutes in, but legislation. So we do a lot of education. We educate our partners. We help with strategy and review. We even educate some legislators on what would be the impacts of these issues and what are the nuts and bolts of funding this or not funding this. So some of the really important issues that were successful in 2023 was a big part was budget. We had a big influx of resources that reshaped Maryland Department of the Environment, NDE's Water and Science Administration. And in some units, that was a 50% bump for desperately needed hires. And you can imagine what that means if there aren't permit writers or permit reviewers, if there aren't inspectors, if there aren't enough assistant attorney generals that work with MDE. So they're there to actually enforce the law. I'll repeat the well-worn line, Lincoln's well-worn line that law without enforcement is just good advice. You have to have enforcement. You can't just have good law. You must enforce it. Otherwise, and we'll talk more about that. And we'll talk about some of the issues in our litigation that come up based on some of those difficulties with agency enforcement. For example, they passed a zombie bill. What does that mean? Well, it means we had permits that were languishing, that were not renewed, that had 15, 20-year-old backlogged zombie permits that had unaddressed flaws, that had old limits that weren't current with the newer requirements and deadlines for the Clean Water Act and state law. So this backlog created a huge issue because it also created something of a permit shield for polluters to hide behind. Because when you had a broken permit that was 20 years old, it's very hard for the public to enforce it. It's even hard for the agency to enforce it because they have to wait until it's renewed oftentimes. So you were talking about hundreds of non-compliant permits that were also sort of languishing in this zombie land of unrenewed permits as well. So that helped address that, and it started the agency, it sort of twisted the agency's arm to get on a path to addressing all of these and have a deadline for them. A lot of positions were filled. 43 positions were filled, again, including inspectors. That will make all of the difference. Construction site pollution, that will be addressed in a new bill to stop and address violations of large construction site blowouts. We'll talk about that later. As one of our colleagues, Evan Isaacson, said, there are some construction sediment and erosion problems that you can see from space from one site. So it's a big problem and it happens. And it's not a one-off in Maryland. Transparency, I'll try to move on to, I just want to touch briefly on some climate issues. One of the big wins that we had, and boy, it sounds esoteric, but it touches everyone in the state, particularly communities that are low-lying, which oftentimes are also vulnerable communities, is a climate bill that requires updated standards. So the newer permitting has to adapt itself to the newest intensity, duration, and frequency data so that they can't have old permits that rely on 20 to 30-year-old data. They have to renew those permits with the newest data, and they have to look at 5-year trends. So this will make an enormous difference because if you think about a site across the street from you or in any town near you, if they are permitting a facility or a giant development or anything like it, and they're using 20 to 30-year-old data on a permit you already think is weak, or the partnering organizations you're fighting it with think is weak, imagine how much worse it'll be with 30-year-old data. So they're already, it's sort of built to fail when they don't consider that. Looking ahead for 2024, this is something we work a lot with our partners with to think about some of the gaps. Standing citizen suits, it's a huge issue in both Maryland and Virginia. We saw that after this landmark Sackett versus EPA decision. What does that mean? It means there was a dramatic curtailing and retraction and diminution of the reach of protections under the Clean Water Act. And what does that mean? It means you, the public, cannot bring an action to stop a polluter. Why? Because the state doesn't give you access. And where you lose federal jurisdiction, you may not bring a Clean Water Act suit. It's not just shortening the reach of EPA, it's shortening the reach of the public. And so one of the crippling aspects of some state laws, like in Maryland and Virginia, is that they do not allow citizen access to the courts for permit violations. You have to wait. You have to kind of pace and beg and wait for a state agency to bring an action, and then maybe you can intervene in that action. Now, that's a brand new, and it's something we worked very hard on in the past few years. That's a brand new law that CLA has now used several times. We may have been the first to use it, actually, to actually intervene in a state case in Maryland, where the agency brought a Maryland Water Pollution Control Law and a Clean Water Act action against polluters, and we intervened. I should also note that we actually filed that suit in federal court first, and the agency then filed right after we did, and we intervened in that case as well. But again, after Sackett, we really need the states to step up and provide citizen access. There are some other issues that I think, while important, we should probably move on from legislation. Can we go to the next slide?
Sure. I just want to note that if you are interested in learning more about the Sackett decision and the implications on not just the work that CLA does in the watershed, but the implications to clean water nationally and specifically within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we have a webinar posted on our website from June, I believe, that it goes in depth on that decision, and I would encourage you all to check that out.
And these types of efforts are why, and I'll hand it over to Molly, our Community Legal Education Center is so critical, because all of the research and policy work and strategies and the way we tie together our litigation and initiatives in general has to be communicated to our partners, to legislators, to communities, law firms, you name it, universities. And that's done through our Community Legal Education Center. Molly, you want to take that over?
Sure, thank you. Oh, so a little bit more, I thought that I skipped one. A little bit more about our education center. We are both reactive and proactive with the education center. So we receive requests from community members and partner organizations wanting to know more about specific issues. And we then are able to provide them with information that we've already put together, or we design it for them for that specific audience in the way that best meets their needs, best helps them understand what the law is and how they can use it. We're also proactive in the center. So there are gaps that we've identified as an organization where we think it would benefit our partner organizations and constituents to know more about the issue, some of these legal issues. And so we're able to put together proactively legal resources, educational resources for people, and then get them out in ways like webinars or written education materials. It really runs the gamut. In 2023, to date, we've had at least 18, we've done at least 18 presentations, both virtual, and thank goodness we're back to a few in person here and there. It's really wonderful to be able to get in front of people in person to be able to help them understand what the law is better. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to do it in person. We have put together a ton of written educational resources. Many of these resources are available to you on our website. I would really encourage you to check those out. You can find them under a variety of different tabs on the website, depending on what it is exactly that you're trying to look for. And another really great thing that we have in the Legal Education Center is our law clerk program. So we work year round with law students for either credit for law school or a living stipend for living expenses. And we get to have these law students temporarily as a part of our team. They get to learn about what it is like to be an advocate at a small environmental nonprofit, and they get to learn more about the issues that we are working on. And right now, as you'll see on the next slide, when David tells you a little bit more about the litigation that we've been doing over the past year, it's really a chance for them to dive deeply into some really cutting edge litigation issues in the neighborhoods in which they live. So we draw a lot of students from University of Maryland, University of Baltimore, and a lot of our litigation issues happen right in their backyard. So it's a really fantastic opportunity for them. As far as what we have coming up in 2024, we plan to again be reactive and proactive in the educational offerings that we are putting out into the community. If you or your organization needs education as to a certain aspect of legal issues in the Bay, please reach out to us, and I'd be happy to chat with you about what we can offer and how we can provide those services. One of the things that we really want to do in the upcoming year is get our education outside more. So a lot of what we tend to do is be focused on kind of sitting behind a computer, behind a desk. And as environmental advocates, that can be hard for us because so much of what we're working towards, so much of what we care about, so much of what we want to educate our partners and our community members about is not behind this computer, right? It's actually outside. So we're doing a lot of brainstorming and a lot of planning as to how we can take our legal education and put an outdoor kind of focus to it, component to it, to help community members and partner organizations put the two together to see that intersection and really kind of get those creative thoughts going. And it's more fun for us too, because we get to spend some more time outside. So that's going to be one of our big pushes for 2024. And the other thing that I just want to mention tonight, because it's just so exciting, is we announced, let's see, 2 weeks ago now, we announced the founding of the Ridge Hall Clerkship Program for Environmental Advocacy. This is a funded clerkship program that will provide opportunities for 2 summer clerks with CLA to spend time with us learning the ins and outs of environmental advocacy in the Chesapeake Bay. The clerkship will allow us to continue to educate the next generation of environmental advocates in the name and in the honor of Ridge Hall, who is not only one of our founding board members, but also he continues to be a really integral part of the work that CLA does, both as a volunteer attorney and as a mentor to our staff, to our law clerks, and to the volunteer attorneys that work with the organization. So I'm really thrilled to be able to announce that as many times as I can. And that's what I've got for the Education Center, David.
Okay, thank you.
Take it to litigation.
And yes, so as part of the litigation effort and CLA's pro bono network efforts since its founding, its founder and co-founder Russ Stevenson also was honored 2 weeks ago, and we presented an award that is now the annual Chesapeake Legal Alliance pro bono Russ Stevenson pro bono Services Award for Excellence. So each year we'll be awarding that to an outstanding pro bono attorney who's really dedicated his or her time and has really exhibited excellence in that service and makes a lot of the cases I'm about to talk about possible, including many that don't show up here because we do so much through our network attorneys. Because as I mentioned, there's over 300, and it makes a lot of the, dozens and dozens. And I think we place something like nearly 100 each year, I think we're at now. So it's actually pretty astonishing these days. And that those numbers, we just started hitting those last year. So I'm going to try to, I hope everyone had their coffee. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. There's probably going to be a lot of questions, but I'll do my best to give you some interesting insights, but stay at a high enough level that we can all understand each other in a short amount of time. The Baltimore wastewater treatment plants. This is a great place to start. We mentioned before how vital these are. I'll just give you a figure, and it'll be important for the animal feeding operations case that I touch on next. It is something like 10 times more expensive to remove a pound of nitrogen from a wastewater treatment plant than it is from say, installing a best management practice for agriculture. So we have come a long way for wastewater treatment plants through these enhanced nutrient removal upgrades. But they have to work, and the agencies have to oversee these wastewater treatment plants. In Baltimore, working with we were doing some research and watchdogging, and we flagged some strange permit violations for one and then two of the wastewater treatment plants in Baltimore. And we work closely with Blue Water Baltimore, so we flagged it for them. They went out and did sampling. And as a result, Angela Heron and Evan Isaacson filed the notice of intent to sue on behalf of Blue Water Baltimore, and then filed that suit in federal court for violations of the Clean Water Act. We knew they were serious, and it only got worse. The state then filed its own action. We intervened subsequently after they had filed. We filed a federal case. They filed the state case shortly thereafter, and we intervened in that case. These are the two largest wastewater treatment plants in the state. The amount of pollution above their permit list limits was such a large proportion of the nitrogen, of the nutrient and pollution problem, that they were essentially responsible for the state not meeting its the entire state's reductions for the limits for bay restoration. They're of enormous importance for a variety of reasons, including public health reasons, because there are a lot of outfalls in and around Baltimore and the neighboring communities. And we, as a result of MDE filing, we ended up pretty early on in three-way negotiations. So the litigation continued. It's been going on for 2 years. And we actually ended up with a very cooperative relationship after some months with MDE and the city over the past 2 years. So we're happy to say that the acute problems that led to partially treated sewage discharges ended, and they are now essentially within their permit limits, and we're working on a consent decree that will, we hope, permanently, or at least for the foreseeable future, improve and maintain the improvements with the wastewater treatment plants. And we are hoping that that consent decree will be finished by the end of the year. So that was a huge piece of litigation. Some of the highlights real quickly: the consent decree would require transparency and public notification, which is important because you need to understand what's happening at the plants and where the pollution points are most problematic, how the money is being spent on what issues. That would include third-party oversight to ensure that the city follows the consent decree. And I think importantly that a good chunk of the penalties don't simply go as penalties. They'll be used to support supplemental environmental projects, SEPs as we call them, to help the impacted areas and to help environmental restoration in the impacted communities. See, these were critical, and I think we can easily say they wouldn't have happened were it not for the involvement of Blue Water Baltimore and Chesapeake Legal Alliance. So we're very proud of this work. I think one of the other interesting developments is that as a result, a lot of attention from the legislature came, and they created, at our request and recommendation, they created a task force to look at the challenges in the larger Baltimore wastewater and drinking water management. And they're now convening to look at regional models similar to the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, WSSC. So we're very proud of that. I'll mention we recently filed suit again on behalf of Blue Water Baltimore against Fleischmann's Vinegar in Baltimore for 2 very large fish kills and ongoing discharges, serious ones, and that is ongoing. So I can't say too much more about that. Animal feeding operations. We did just give a talk on this. Molly, jump in, but it's available. Forgive me for the first 90 seconds where I fumble around, but it's actually fascinating because we talk about the case. We talk about where it started, the impacts, similar to the Baltimore plants, but even larger. Animal feeding operations, the poultry industry in Maryland, on Maryland's Eastern Shore, represents 550 operations, not houses, operations. It releases as a whole tens of millions, as much as 40 million pounds of nitrogen, ammonia, which is a form of nitrogen, every year. Millions of those pounds of nitrogen deposit onto surrounding lands and reach the tributaries and the bay. This happens via, you can see in that picture what a chicken house looks like. These poultry houses raise the chicks from, chick's age through adulthood, and then they go to the processor. They go to the slaughterhouse for all the big companies you heard of, Tyson, Mount Air, Purdue, Pilgrim's Pride, etc. Those tunnel houses or warehouses are full of chicks, up to 50,000 per house. So every year, over 300 million birds are processed. 300 million. That produces a great deal of waste. That waste produces a great deal of ammonia, a form of nitrogen. It's blown out of those chicken houses and deposits on the surrounding land. To give you an idea of what this means is that a recent study, and it was a study that really helped enable the lawsuit, was a study by North Carolina State, actually partly funded and partly coordinated by Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So credit to them for bringing that study. And it piggybacked off previous studies by Seaford and others. And they all studied the dispersal of ammonia so that it's not just created, that it moves a short distance and falls onto land. And they predicted, all of these studies predicted that something like 40 to 70% of the ammonia, again, nitrogen, it's a sticky gas, is blown out of these houses and falls within about 1.5 miles. So most of it falls on the Eastern Shore. They say that up to 70% falls within the Eastern Shore in the Bay watershed. So the Atlantic coastal bays and Chesapeake Bay are directly affected. Every major tributary on Maryland's Eastern Shore where these operations exist are impaired for nitrogen. Choptank, Pocomoke, Anacostia, Wicomico, all of them, in large part because of all this nitrogen. So we won in the lower court, Montgomery County Circuit Court. We brought the suit and we challenged the agency for failing in its permitting scheme in the statewide general permit for animal feeding operations. The Maryland Department of the Environment simply said they didn't have the authority or the obligation to regulate ammonia. We challenged that and we won at the lower court. The agency appealed our win, which, we really felt like they snatched a defeat from an easy victory because they could have simply added some terms in the permit, but they appealed. we applied for and got certification for the Supreme Court of Maryland, and then litigated it there. The Supreme Court of Maryland heard the case, but in that case, the agency flipped it around and said, we were just kidding. We do regulate ammonia. We've always regulated ammonia. Here's how we do it. And that was a tough loss because we just recently got the ruling from the Supreme Court of Maryland that the agency has discretion on how they regulate. So there's an important takeaway here and a path ahead, which is the agency told the court that they regulate ammonia. And they said that they have factors by which they do it. And the court said, okay, well, you have this extreme deference that we'll give you all this discretion to do it. And that was the ruling. So we have been working with the agency since then to actually go ahead and do that, because as we've said to them a couple times now, hey, you guys said you regulate it, so let's go ahead and do that. And the thing is, it's going to be essentially free to the industry, because the best management practices to control ammonia are low cost and low tech. And in fact, they're almost free based on cost share and subsidy programs. Think of tree buffers, shelter belts, vegetative environmental buffers, and amendments to the litter, like alum, aluminum sulfate, reduces ammonia off-gassing from the north. So we're moving ahead. We're looking ahead. We're actually looking ahead in other states. But that's the animal feeding operations.
David, may I interrupt for just a second?
Sure.
I just want to point out to the audience how the last few litigation cases that David described are emblematic of two of the main ways that CLA approaches water quality issues in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So David mentioned before that, you can have the best laws on the book, but if no one's enforcing them, then they're meaningless. So the first couple of cases that David mentioned, the wastewater treatment plant case and the Fleischman's case, that's an enforcement issue. That's us looking at a law that is in place, and that's ensuring that the federal government and the state government and the various agencies that are involved with enforcing those laws are enforcing them the way that they should be applied. The AFO, the animal feeding operations case, that's an example of CLA working kind of at the beginning of that. So looking at what the law is that's being created, looking at what the regulation is that's being created, looking at what the permit is that's being created, and making sure that that law, that regulation, that permit is as tight as possible. It's as environmentally friendly as possible, that it meets all of the requirements that federal law needs it to have in order to fit that regulatory scheme. So that is it. I just want to point out that those are two really good examples of how CLA works to create law, policy, regulation, permit on one end, and then comes in and makes sure that they are enforced, those things are enforced on the back end.
Thanks, Molly. That's very helpful. Speaking of that, menhaden. Atlantic menhaden are described as the most important fish in the Atlantic and the most important fish in the Chesapeake Bay. Why? They're a high protein, oily forage fish. And what does that mean? It means they're these small, maybe even not so small, base of the food chain keystone species. And they are the food source for all of the larger fish in the bay. And the bay, of course, as with many fish, is something of a hatchery. So there's a lot of juvenile populations that move up into the bay, including for menhaden. Menhaden used to be like the stars in the bay, not so much anymore. And when menhaden suffer, all of the dependent species suffer dramatically. Think of every sport fish, striper, red drum, cobia, all of them. You know them as rockfish, striped bass, rockfish, striper. I'm from New Jersey. But also marine mammals, humpback whales, dolphins. We're actually giving a talk on menhaden in a couple of weeks. And we're going to put up a map and you can see in a week, no, 2 weeks. And you can see the path of humpback whales follow all of the landings from menhaden. And I wonder why. They brave those shipping channels in and out of the bay because they rely on them. Ospreys and eagles. Osprey levels are down to basically DDT level hatching. So that the hatchlings, the fledgling ospreys are dying in the nest because of a lack of menhaden. So there's a huge cascade of effects. Virginia maintains the menhaden industry. So the menhaden industry is centered in Virginia. It is one company, by the way. You can't make this stuff up. I don't know if there's Carl Hyacin fans out there, but you kind of can't make this stuff up. So one privately held foreign company actually owns the only industrial harvester in the area, in the region. And that fishery, that one industrial harvester, which is one company, gets 2/3 of the catch for the Atlantic, the entire Atlantic. You're talking about something like 700 million fish, 340 or 50 million pounds. And the entire catch for the bay for Virginia is about 380 million pounds. So 700 million fish. The Virginia law requires that the commission, the Fisheries Commission, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, to regulate this, and has relatively robust laws on the books that require that it manage this fishery with conservation and management measures. It has failed to do that. So on behalf of the Southern Maryland Recreational Fishing Organization, Chesapeake Legal Alliance filed suit in Virginia Circuit Court challenging the state Virginia Commission's failure to regulate this industry and essentially a giveaway, and that menhaden are being locally depleted and fished to dangerous levels based on this sort of artifact of industrial landings and not on science. So that case is ongoing. In fact, we just had a hearing on September 7th, and a ruling just came out where the state tried to dismiss our case. The judge gave them one claim, but the case is maintained. He ruled against them on the main claim. So we are excited to move ahead with that. We feel like the judge has found merit in our case, and we're moving forward with that. So more to come on the menhaden issue.
The presentation is on the 26th, and we are sending out emails. We've sent out emails. It's on the link to register is on our website, but if you are having any trouble finding it, please just shoot me an email and I'll help you figure it out.
Yeah, and if you wonder what this has to do with water quality, menhaden are like schools of oysters. They filter, a single fish filters up to 7 gallons a minute. So it's not just the health of all the species in and around the bay, it's also for water quality. Very briefly, development and sacrifice zones. This is a huge aspect. You know, it's not just the wastewater treatment plant work or the CAFO work. You know, this is a lot of our environmental justice work and work with vulnerable communities, has to do with land use. And you can see from these pictures, you know, off to the bottom right, you'll see the Lothian matters, plural. We call these sacrifice zones. There's these sort of archaic miszoning, special exception sections and conditional use. In one case, in Lothian, there's an over 50-year-old miszoning, and nobody can challenge it. And we had an initial win by one of our network attorneys that's now been overturned, and we're appealing it. But there are reclamation sites, gravel pits, closed landfills, wastewater treatment plants, you name it, and all of the truck traffic, which you see that little inset. And of course, there's communities of color in and around there that say, there's something else that's looking to be zoned there. And they say, hey, enough is enough. How much are you going to cite in this spot? You know, there's communities that live here. And then you see in the bottom left, that's our Abingdon Woods fight. We've been working on that since its inception with the Gunpowder Riverkeeper and local community groups. That was over 300 acres of forested areas and including forested wetlands and Tier 2 waters, part of the Bush River watershed. And that was essentially slated for development at the county level, and we got in early and fought that. And then we fought it at the state level because adjacent to this are these sort of dilapidated and decadent warehouse areas, and they didn't want to build there. They picked 300 acres of wetland forest. instead. And so some of that was actually protected wetland forests under the law. And the agency gave them the exception. And we fought that. We actually got the case remanded. And then the court ruled against us. And, the state, we remanded it. The state passed the permit again. And we lost in a challenge to that. But we appealed it, not to be sore losers, but we really want to press the issue of when is enough, just like the animal feeding operation case. You can give deference to an agency, but if they are failing to enforce the laws, forested wetland laws, wetlands and waterway laws, easy laws to enforce, and they're just, frankly, rubber stamping permits. We need the courts to start to look at what it means to give deference to the agency, and this is a case for that. And I mentioned before, and I'll try to wrap up in another minute, we pick cases for high impact issues. Well, this is a high impact issue because it rears its ugly head in so many cases where we always take a deep breath when we challenge a permit or an issue, because the court is loath to not give deference to the agency. And that makes sense most of the time. But sometimes when the discretion is just so overwhelming that the agency can say or do anything and they get rubber stamped and the court lets them for whatever project, that's what we want the courts to spend a little bit more time looking at. So briefly, and then we should keep moving, Molly, and I think I'll turn it over to you. Looking ahead, we have some updates. We're updating a few things, a violations tracker. We also, as part of our post-Sackett initiative, it's about headwaters. It's about where the sensitive areas are. It's about environmental justice areas and low-lying communities. We're working with some partners, including Chesapeake Conservancy and another conservancy and other partners, to try to map out and identify and do the research and figure out where the sensitive areas, where are the areas with weak laws, and where are the areas that if you develop enough of the upstream, I mean, that was the big loss with the Sackett versus EPA decision. If you ignore upland wetlands or upstream wetlands and headwaters, and you start to develop them, you're talking about creating a new Ellicott City every 5 years. And so we want to start to map out these sensitive areas and, mix some offensive and defense in that initiative. Our 2-year plan remains. We've restructured our staff to sort of hit hardest and be as efficient as possible with our centers. We are looking to hire a new staff attorney, a new support person with our growing support from our funders and our supporters. And of course, our work expands into Pennsylvania and Virginia, and that does take resources. So we're already doing that. We have initiatives in both, and we're already, there's a lot of our work, the data centers and the Manhattan case, and some enforcement are already in Virginia. And similarly, we have enforcement and initiatives in Pennsylvania that are growing. You want to go to the next slide? I think that was it. I think we're at questions. Great.
So we've had a couple of questions come in over the course of the conversation, and the first one I know Will answered in the question box, but I'll talk about it a little bit if people are not tracking the question box or they're not able to see it. Someone wanted to know what types of opportunities that there are available to lawyers in our network that are not trained as environmental lawyers. Great. So for example, corporate transactions, that type of thing. We have plenty of those opportunities. So one of the ways that we help our partners and our community members is with legal issues that aren't necessarily classic environmental law issues, but if we can help alleviate the burden of that partner organization or that community having to pay an attorney to do something like review contracts or help them with a tax issue. Oftentimes we have organizations come to us needing help filing their 501c3 formation papers, those types of corporate issues, reviewing an HR manual, those types of things. If we can help take the burden off of those partners or those communities and help them find a pro bono lawyer to help them do that kind of legal work for them, we know that their energy, their resources, their money are going to be better put towards a cleaner, more restored, healthier Chesapeake Bay. And because of that, that fits within the mission of our organization, and we're able to handle those types of issues. Now, if you look at the 6 of us who are attorneys on staff, none of us are HR attorneys, none of us are corporate lawyers. So those are always going to be things that come in through our intake process and then get pushed out as a request for assistance to the lawyers in our network. If you know an attorney who is gun shy to join our network because they are not an environmental attorney, please reassure him or her that we have these types of available cases that come in, these types of available issues that come in. And if they want to know more about those opportunities, have them contact me or my colleague, Will Hellman, and we're happy to walk them through those types of questions and opportunities.
And to put a fine point on that, it's an excellent opportunity to learn, because as we talked about before, we don't just provide, it's not that Molly and the rest of the staff go around educating everybody. We get educated by our network. We are educated by our partners in the communities, and we educate them in kind, and we arrange and coordinate educational modules through our network. So we're all educating each other, and anyone who wants to become a pro bono network attorney can learn a great deal. We learn from each other all the time. We co-present to each other all the time. And there are lots of resources and modules and trainings that we give as well as receive for that exact issue.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Dave, this is a question that you are going to be better off to answer. How long will it take for the MDE precip updates to impact local stormwater management regulations?
That's a good question.
The follow-up statement to that is my county staff seems to slow walk updating the precip characteristics.
Oh, wow. Good. Follow up with us. So it's part and parcel with the other aspects of our really watershed moments, pun intended, about the legislative wins, is the requirement to update within a 5-year window all of the permits is real. And so as the permits are updated, they have to be using the newest data set. So it should be, it's not like they have to run out and update all of the limits for every permit. And of course, there's a lot of different permits. There's statewide general permits, industrial, the animal feeding operation, construction, but there's also individual NPDES permits. National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits. It's sort of when you think of a classic Clean Water Act permit for a facility, that's what they have. That's what Fleischmann's has. That's what the wastewater treatment plants have. The general permit was the AFO industry. So it will depend on the permit, and it depends on when it's renewed. And so the zombie permit addresses how often that happens, and the zombie permit bill and legislation addressed that. And the climate bill addressed the frequency with which they have to update it. And of course, the funding and transparency and enforcement bills all work together to have more new staff to actually review these permits. So I think the answer is it should be less than 5 years for almost every permit now, which is it's a yeoman's effort. There's a lot of backlogs. I mean, it's not an easy job. We work with a lot of great, I have no problem hammering on MDE, but we work with a lot of great MDE staff and assistant attorneys general. They work hard, but we call them out. If they're hiding under their desk, they shouldn't. Shame on them. But a lot of them are really great, and they have a lot to do. So we try to support, we work with them. We're not trying to be opponents all the time and across the V. Any other questions we want to cover?
Those were the two that came in during, we had a few come in before the webinar that we can address directly with the people that asked them if the questions were not addressed over the last hour. But I think for the sake of everyone's evening, we should wrap up.
Yeah, so this will all tie together. I mean, I mentioned before, these are strategies. So we work with partners that are at odds with our litigation strategy or our policy strategies. But still, we work with them. We have great relationships with a lot of all of the organizations in the watershed, and we try to have great relationships with all the staff and agencies. Because we're small, we have to be small and mighty and efficient. So every piece of litigation we have has a strategy behind it, and we talked a little bit about them. And so, being a small nonprofit with 7 staff and having all of the work, and we didn't even talk about it all. We just want to remind everybody that, join us, work with us, reach out to us, access our resources, bring us, your partnerships, your issues, your experiences, and please help support us. Spread the word. It's not just about outreach, it's also about philanthropy. So we, for every $1 donated, that's $5 in free legal services. We have matching opportunities for matching grants coming up this fall. And we certainly would love your support in any way you can give it.
So thank you all so much for spending the last hour with us, learning a little bit about all of the successes that we've had over the past year and some of our plans for the future. Again, the Menhaden webinar is on October 26th at 12 p.m. The registration link is on our website. We will also be emailing it out at least once or twice over the course of the next couple of weeks. Please join us so that you can learn more about that really interesting and necessary case that CLA is involved in. If you have any questions that weren't addressed tonight that you want to follow up with me and or David about, our email addresses are on the screen. They are also available on the CLA website, chesapeakelegal.org. Thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Molly.